4,300 people packed the Callaway County Fairgrounds that Saturday in August of 2019, and most of them had already made up their minds about the woman standing next to the faded green International at the far end of the staging lane. You could see it in the way they looked at her. Not with malice exactly, but with that particular brand of patient amusement that people reserve for things they've already decided don't belong. She was 53 years old, wearing a canvas work shirt with the left sleeve rolled to the elbow and the right sleeve gone entirely, cut off at the shoulder sometime in a previous decade for reasons that had nothing to do with fashion. Her name was Darlene Pruitt, and the truck beside her was a 1974 International Lodestar with a hood that had been primer gray since Gerald Ford was president, and a cab that had been repaired with 3 different colors of body filler in 3 different decades. The pull hook welded to the frame was the cleanest thing on the vehicle. She'd made sure of that. 40 feet down the staging lane, in the space that organizers had quietly expanded to accommodate it, sat the machine that everyone had actually come to see. Meridian Motorsports out of Nashville had trailered it in on a purpose-built 3-axle hauler the color of brushed aluminum, and the truck itself, a purpose-built pulling machine wearing the body of a 2018 Chevrolet Silverado that had never once been used to haul anything, carried 4 separate sponsor logos in colors that cost more per square foot than Darlene's property taxes. The crew wore matching shirts. They had a canopy with the team name embroidered on the valance. The engine alone, a twin-turbocharged competition diesel built to the absolute limit of the modified class rules, had cost $260,000 to develop and another $40,000 to install. Someone in the grandstands had printed that number on a sign, $300,000. The sign was not subtle. Darlene's total investment in the International, from the day she'd bought it out of a field in Graves County for $1,100 to the morning she'd driven it to Callaway behind her pickup truck on a borrowed trailer, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $9,400. She'd kept the receipts in a coffee can on the workbench, not because she was proud of the number, but because she was the kind of person who kept receipts. One of the Meridian crew members walked down the lane to look at the International. He stood beside it for a moment with his arms folded, the way a man stands when he's trying to decide if something's worth the effort of being curious about. He said something to the man beside him. Both of them laughed. Darlene was checking the valve cover torque on the passenger side and did not look up. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without it, the rest of this story is just a truck pulling a sled. And it is not just a truck pulling a sled. What happened at Callaway County that August was a specific kind of education, the kind that happens in public, in front of 4,000 people, and that nobody who was there has ever quite been able to stop talking about. But before I can take you to that strip of compacted clay, I need to take you back about 4 years, to a machine shed on the edge of a grain farm in Marshall County, Kentucky, and to the woman who spent 14 months alone in it, building something the world had not asked for and did not expect. Here is something worth knowing about where Darlene Pruitt came from. Her father, Raymond Pruitt, had farmed 1,100 acres of corn and soybeans in Marshall County for 41 years, and he had done it almost entirely with International harvester equipment. Not because International was the obvious choice in any given decade, but because Raymond had learned International on his father's farm, and understood it the way you understand a language you grew up speaking. He could diagnose an engine by sound alone. A particular knock, a specific whistle in the intake, the way an injector pump sounded when it was 3 weeks from failure versus 3 months. He taught Darlene to do the same thing starting when she was 8 years old, standing on an overturned bucket beside a running DT466 with her eyes closed and her father's hand on her shoulder, listening. She never went to an engineering school. She took 2 semesters of diesel mechanics at the vocational program in Benton, and then came back to the farm because Raymond's knees had given out and someone needed to run the equipment. She married a man named Carl Pruitt. No relation, a coincidence that amused people at the courthouse, who drove a grain truck for a co-op and came home on weekends and never once complained about the fact that his wife spent more hours under machinery than she did inside the house. Carl had a quality that is rarer than people acknowledge. He understood the difference between being involved in something and being in the way of it. He brought sandwiches to the machine shed. He went back to the house. She had been pulling competitively, in a limited and local way, since 2009. A neighbor named Harlan Bess had talked her into it with a truck she'd rebuilt for him as a side job, a 1969 Ford F250 with a 401 cubic inch International engine transplanted into it, which Harlan had pulled at county events for 3 seasons, before his back made it impossible for him to drive anything with a manual transmission. He'd signed the title over to her for the cost of the registration. She'd pulled it for 2 years and learned the geometry of the sport, the way a sled's progressive resistance worked, the way the weight transfer mechanism changed the load curve as the sled moved down the track, the way the clay surface temperature affected traction at different points in the pull. She kept notes in a spiral notebook. She still has that notebook. The International Lodestar was a different project entirely. She'd found it in 2015, sitting in a fence row on a farm in Graves County with the hood up and a family of starlings nesting in the air cleaner housing. The owner, an elderly man named Doyle Crenshaw, had bought it as a grain truck in 1978 and parked it in 1991 when the injection pump failed and the repair estimate was more than the truck was worth. It had sat for 24 years. The cab was solid, Lodestars were built with thicker steel than most people remember, and the frame was clean underneath the surface rust. The engine, a DT466, that had been bored and stroked by someone with knowledge before Doyle ever bought it, was seized but not destroyed. Darlene walked around it twice, put her hand flat on the hood, and offered Doyle $1,100 in cash. He took it. She spent the next 14 months in her machine shed doing the kind of work that doesn't look like progress until it suddenly does. She pulled the engine and sent the block to a machinist in Paducah named Everett Sims, who had been building diesel competition engines since the 1980s, and who looked at the existing bore work and told her that whoever had done it originally had known exactly what they were doing. She had Everett bore it again, not dramatically, but precisely, and fit it with a set of forged pistons she'd sourced from a truck that had been used in Australian outback mining operations, where engines run at sustained high load for weeks at a time and the metallurgy reflects that demand. The connecting rods she had shot peened and magnafluxed and reinstalled. The crankshaft she sent to a shop in Memphis that specialized in diesel crankshaft grinding and came back to her with inspect to tolerances that Everett called unnecessarily precise, which was the closest he came to a compliment. But I need to stop here, because this is the part that matters. This is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that strip of clay at Callaway County. And I need you to stay with me for a few minutes, because if you don't understand this, you'll think what happened was luck. It was not luck. Every truck pull is fundamentally a torque contest, not a horsepower contest. The sled's progressive resistance system works by shift and weight forward, onto the sled as it moves down the track, which means the load on the pulling vehicle increases continuously from the moment the chain goes tight to the moment the vehicle stops. What this means in practical terms is that the engine that wins a pull is not the engine that makes the most power at high RPM. It's the engine that makes the most torque at low RPM, because as the sled gets heavier, the vehicle slows down, and as the vehicle slows down, the engine RPM drops, and the engine that is still making force at the bottom of its power band is the engine that keeps moving while every other engine stalls. Think about that for a moment. The competition engine in the Meridian truck was engineered to produce its maximum output at somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 revolutions per minute. It was a masterpiece of high RPM diesel performance. Twin turbos sized for peak boost at high engine speeds, injection timing optimized for the top of the power band, fuel delivery calibrated for maximum output when the engine is spinning fast. It was, by every conventional measure, a more powerful engine than anything Darlene Pruitt had built. On a dynamometer, it would have made the International's numbers look modest. But a truck pull is not a dynamometer. A truck pull is a progressively increasing load applied to an engine that is simultaneously slowing down. And what Darlene had built, deliberately and with full understanding of what she was doing, was an engine that was optimized for the exact opposite end of the power band. The T466 in the International was built to make its peak torque at 1,400 revolutions per minute. Not 3,200. Not 2,600. 1,400 revolutions per minute, which is barely above idle for a diesel engine, which is the speed at which most engines are already running out of breath and beginning to fall apart. She had achieved this through a combination of factors that each contributed a piece. The injector nozzles were custom ground to a larger orifice than stock, which increased fuel delivery at low throttle openings. The injection timing was retarded from the factory specification by 4 degrees, which shifted the combustion event later in the cycle and moved the torque peak down the RPM range. The turbocharger was a single unit, not twin turbos, not a compound setup, a single carefully selected turbocharger from a Caterpillar marine application, sized specifically to reach full boost pressure at 1,200 revolutions per minute, which meant it was already working at maximum efficiency before most competition engines had even begun to spool. Everett Sims, when she'd explained what she was trying to build, had been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, "You're building a draft horse?" She'd said yes. He'd said, "Most people come in here wanting a racehorse." She'd said she knew. He'd built it the way she asked. The Meridian truck had $300,000 and a team of 6 engineers. Darlene Pruitt had $9,400 and a machinist in Paducah who understood what she was trying to do. And here is what Meridian absolutely did not know. She had not built a truck that competed with theirs on their terms. She had built a truck that competed with theirs on entirely different terms, on the only terms that mattered on a pull track, and by the time they understood that, it would be too late to matter. The morning of the pull, the temperature at the Callaway County Fairgrounds was 87 degrees at 9 o'clock and climbing. This is relevant because air temperature affects turbocharger efficiency. Denser, cooler air carries more oxygen per cubic foot, which means more combustion potential, which means more torque. Hot air is thinner. Hot air is the enemy of turbocharged engines, and it affects high RPM engines more than low RPM engines, because high RPM engines move more air per minute, and the density deficit compounds with every revolution. Darlene had known it would be hot. She'd calibrated the injection timing the previous evening with the temperature in mind, retarding it 1 additional degree to account for the heat's effect on combustion timing. She'd written the number in the spiral notebook. She'd slept 6 hours and driven to Callaway at 5:30 in the morning to walk the track surface before anyone else arrived. The clay was dry on the edges and dark in the center where the maintenance crew had watered it the previous afternoon. She walked the full length of it in her work boots, feeling the surface through her soles, noting where the compaction was firm and where it had a half-inch of loose material on top. She came back to the truck and let 3 pounds of air out of the rear tires. Not 4. Not 2. 3 pounds, which she had calculated would give her the contact patch she needed on the surface she'd found, without sacrificing the structural rigidity she needed to transfer torque without tire squirm. She wrote the pressure numbers in the notebook. At 11:40 in the morning, the Meridian truck made its pull. The crowd had been building since 10 o'clock, and by the time the Silverado backed into position and the crew began the hookup procedure, the grandstands were full and the fence line 3 deep. The engine startup was an event by itself. The twin turbos spooling, the exhaust note climbing from a low rumble to a sustained mechanical roar that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. The crowd responded to it the way crowds respond to spectacle, with noise and movement and the collective leaning forward that happens when something impressive is about to occur. The Meridian truck pulled to 287 feet. This was a serious number. The track was 300 feet, and a pull of 287 feet in the modified class at a regional event was a number that would win most competitions it entered. The crew celebrated with the controlled professionalism of people who expected to win and had confirmed that expectation. The crowd was loud. The sign with the $300,000 figure on it was raised by someone in the grandstands. Darlene was at the far end of the staging lane, checking the valve-cover torque again, and she did not watch. She was called to the line at 2:43 in the afternoon. The crowd noise changed when she drove the International into position. Not louder, but different. The way crowd noise changes when something unexpected enters a space. There was laughter in it. There were comments she could not hear but could read in the body language of the people making them. The International looked, in the afternoon light, exactly like what it was. A 50-year-old grain truck that had spent 24 years in a fence row, repaired by a woman in a canvas work shirt who had driven it to the fairgrounds on a borrowed trailer. The primer gray hood had a handprint on it where she'd steadied herself climbing down from the cab. She did not wipe it off. She got out of the cab and walked to the rear of the truck and watched the hookup crew attach the chain. She put her hand flat on the left rear fender and held it there for a moment. Then she walked back to the cab and climbed in and pulled the door shut. The International started the way it always started, without ceremony, without drama, without the kind of startup sequence that announces itself to a crowd. The DT 466 fired on the second revolution of the starter and settled immediately into an idle that was lower and steadier than anything the crowd had heard that day. It did not roar. It did not climb. It sat at idle and ran with a mechanical precision that was, to anyone who knew what they were listening to, more impressive than the Meridian truck's theatrical startup. Everett Sims was standing at the fence line near the 200-foot marker. He had driven 4 hours from Paducah. He put both hands in his pockets and listened to the idle and nodded once. The flagman signaled. The chain went tight with a single, sharp metallic note that cut through the crowd noise, and then was gone. And then the International moved. It moved the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar, not with drama, not with noise beyond the engine note climbing through the low registers, but with a quality of absolute commitment that had nothing theatrical about it. The tires pressed into the clay without spinning. The rear suspension crouched and held. A thin line of dark exhaust rose from the stack. Not the black billowing cloud that high RPM competition engines produce, but a steady, controlled column of combustion that said the engine was working at the exact point of maximum efficiency, burning every molecule of fuel it was being given, wasting nothing. At 50 feet, the crowd was quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of people who expected something to stop and have not seen it stop. At 100 feet, the engine note had not changed. This was the thing that began to reach people. Not the distance, but the sound. The DT-466 was pulling at 1,600 revolutions per minute, which meant the sled was already significantly heavier than it had been at the start, which meant the engine was working harder, which meant, in any engine optimized for high RPM, the power should have begun to fall away. The International's engine note had not changed because the engine was still operating within its peak torque band. It had not yet reached the point where it was fighting. It was still at 100 feet, and a sled that had transferred substantial weight forward, operating in the range where it was designed to be. At 150 feet, a man in the grandstand stood up. Then another. The ripple moved through the crowd the way ripples move through water, not because anyone decided to stand, but because the body responds to certain things before the mind catches up. At 200 feet, the engine note dropped 300 RPM. The sled was very heavy now. The tires were pressing into the clay with enough force that you could see the material curling up at the edges of the contact patch, the way clay curls up beside a plow. The exhaust column darkened slightly. The frame of the International flexed in a way that was visible if you were watching the gap between the cab and the bed, which Everett Sims was watching, and which told him the truck was at approximately 80% of maximum load transfer, 230 feet. The crowd noise was building from the bottom up, the way a wave builds, not a roar yet, but the sound of thousands of people beginning to understand what they were watching. 250 feet. The Meridian crew had stopped celebrating. One of the engineers was standing at the fence with his arms at his sides, watching the International's rear tires, and his expression had changed from the controlled professional confidence of earlier in the day to something that was not yet recognition, but was on its way there. 270 feet. 7 feet from the meridian mark. The engine was at 1,100 revolutions per minute now, which was below its peak torque band, which meant it was in territory where most engines quit. The DT-466 did not quit. It was not built to quit at 1,100 revolutions per minute. It was built with enough low-end reserve that 1,100 revolutions per minute was not the bottom. It was the approach to the bottom, and there was still something left below it. The tires had not spun once. The chain had not gone slack once. The truck had moved in a straight line at a speed that was closer to a walking pace than anything that should have produced this result, and it had not stopped. 288 feet, past the meridian mark, past it by 1 foot, and then 2, and then the crowd found its voice all at once, the way crowds do when the thing they were watching but not believing becomes undeniable. It was not a cheer exactly. It was the sound of 4,000 people exhaling simultaneously and then inhaling to make something louder. The International stopped at 301 feet. 1 foot past the full pull line. The engine idled down and sat there, running, patient, indifferent to the noise around it, the same way it had sounded at the start. The exhaust column thinned to almost nothing. The tires settled. The chain went slack. Darlene Pruitt sat in the cab for a moment. Then she got out, walked to the rear of the truck, unhooked the chain herself, walked to the left rear tire, and crouched down to look at the contact patch. She pressed her thumb into the clay beside it. She stood up and walked to the right rear tire and did the same thing. Then she walked to the cab and got her notebook and wrote something in it. The crowd was still making noise. She did not look at the grandstands. Everett Sims came through the gate at the end of the track and walked to her. He stood beside the truck for a moment. Then he put his hand on the fender, in the same place she'd put her hand before the pull. He said, 110 at the bottom. She said, 1150. He said, close enough. That was the entire conversation. The Meridian crew chief came to her 40 minutes later, after the scoring had been confirmed and the crowd had moved on to the next class. He was a man named Garrett Hollis, and he had been building competition pulling engines for 18 years, and he stood next to the International with the expression of someone recalibrating a measurement they had been certain was correct. He asked her what turbocharger she was running. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He asked her what her peak torque RPM was. She told him. He looked at the engine for a long time. Then he said, "We built ours to run at the top." She said, "I know." He said, "You built yours to run at the bottom." She said, "That's where the work gets done." He nodded. He shook her hand. He walked back to the aluminum trailer. Carl had driven down from Marshall County that morning without telling her he was coming. He'd parked his truck at the far end of the lot and watched from the fence near the 300-foot marker. When she came around the side of the International with her notebook in her hand, he was standing there with a thermos of coffee and the particular expression of a man who had known something for a long time and was watching the world catch up to it. She took the thermos. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. 3 weeks after Callaway County, Garrett Hollis drove to Marshall County in a personal vehicle, not a team truck, and knocked on the door of the machine shed. Darlene was inside working on the injection pump. She let him in. He spent 2 hours asking questions and looking at the engine. He didn't take notes. She thought he probably had the kind of memory that didn't need them. When he left, he shook her hand again and said it was the most deliberately built engine he had seen in 20 years of competition. She said she appreciated that. She went back to the injection pump. The International Lodestar is still in the machine shed in Marshall County. The hood is still primer gray. The handprint from the Callaway County pull is still on the fender, or one very like it, because Darlene puts her hand in the same place every time she checks the engine, which is often because that is the kind of person she is. The DT466 runs. It will continue to run. It was built with that in mind. She pulled competitively twice more after Callaway, both times winning her class, both times in events where the organizers had specifically invited her after word traveled through the regional circuit the way word travels in rural communities, not through press releases or social media campaigns, but through the co-op bulletin board and the Sunday parking lot and the parts counter at the equipment dealer in Benton, where the man behind the counter had been at Callaway and told everyone who came in for 3 months afterward what he had seen. The story grew as stories do. The details stayed accurate because the people telling it had been there and had no reason to embellish something that needed no embellishment. The ground doesn't lie. The clay at Callaway County measured exactly what it measured, and the number, 301 feet, past the full pull line, past the $300,000 machine by 14 feet, is in the official record of that event, which still exists, which anyone can find, which says exactly what happened without editorial comment, because the record doesn't need one. Dirt doesn't care what something cost. It just tells you what it is. Darlene Pruitt knew what the International was. She'd known since the second time she'd walked around it in Doyle Crenshaw's fence row in Graves County, with the hood up and the starlings in the air cleaner housing and $1,100 in her pocket. She'd put her hand on the hood and known everything that came after. The 14 months in the machine shed, the machinist in Paducah, the forged pistons from Australian mining trucks, the marine turbocharger, the 4 degrees of retarded timing, the 3 pounds of air from the rear tires, was not discovery. It was confirmation. She was not finding out what the truck could be. She was building what she already knew it was. If this story reached you the way it reached the people standing in those grandstands, if you felt the moment the crowd went quiet, if you understood what it meant when the engine note didn't change at 150 feet, then I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me about the quiet work. Tell me about the person you know, or the machine you've seen, or the moment you watched something the world had written off prove exactly what it was. I read every one of those comments, and I mean that in the plainest possible way. Everyone. The stories people leave in this space are the reason this channel exists. If you're new here, this is what we do every week. We find the stories that didn't make the front page, that didn't get the press release, that lived in the spiral notebook and the machine shed and the co-op bulletin board. We tell them as carefully as we can because they deserve that care. If that's something you want more of, subscribe, and it will be here for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one, someone who's doing the quiet work right now in a shed somewhere with a notebook and a coffee can full of receipts and a machine the world has already decided doesn't belong, pass it on. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. That's always been how it works. That's always been enough.